All right. Great. So, thank you for being here. This is another one of my doc talks. Basically, our monthly talks. I do a talk on just different topics I think are important to health and particularly primary care. This is a topic that I think a lot of doctors maybe don't have a ton of material on. Um, and I think is very important to the human experience. And so just thought I would sort of touch on my thoughts on what spirituality means in life and health. And again, I think it's sort of connected to a lot of these things, which also are different ways to look at spirituality, purpose, meaning, connection. So we're just going to dive right in. After a little disclaimer here, again, this is really just intended for general information purposes. So again, not forming a doctor-patient relationship. Yes, I am a doctor, but that is not the intent of this material. And then again, I have no conflicts of interest, so I don't have any financial ties to anything I talk about in this video or in this talk. And then also just specifically with this topic, let's see. Specifically with this topic, I also have a quick note that basically I do not intend this to be any kind of, endorsement or condemnation on any kind of spiritual practice or religious practice or anything else. Trying to use very general terms throughout, really just to describe how this plays a role in different people's lives. And I think it's up to individuals to really find ways to make that sort of a reality in their lives, right? So however these turn into actions, that's sort of up to the individual, in my opinion. And I'm not here to really, again, sort of push anyone one way or another, just to have a conversation and to provide information. So we'll get started with some objectives. I'm just going to define what is spiritual health. I don't know if that's a term a lot of people use. That's just a term I sort of, again, sort of a general term I'm using to describe something that I think is a universal part of people's experience and an important part of health. So I'm also just going to describe what that looks like over a course of time, that at least what we know about throughout human history. We're going to tie this to those things, like I said, like purpose, meaning, connection, and how that really looks like being healthy, what that means in our overall health, and how that plays a role. Again, may seem obvious, or maybe some people don't think about this at all. I don't know. But would love to have any kind of participation as well if people online want to join in, or any of the people who again, are sitting here, if you would like to ask questions or be a part of the discussion. That is one of the reasons I do it in this forum, is to have some interaction. So please feel free to interrupt me at any point. Let's see, I think I got everyone admitted. All right. So we're also going to talk about ways to explore. Again, part of what I really want to do is bring free, actionable kind of tools to people. So to sort of show people that health is not something that happens in my office, right? It's something you do when you leave my office, hopefully, and continue to do, and maybe even need less of me, not more of me, as time goes on, right? And that's really to your benefit, not to mine necessarily. That means that you're doing really well, and that's what we both want. So anyway, so that's my philosophy in health. And again, a lot of these talks are intended to help whoever will listen. So thanks for being here. You're being recorded. You're being recorded, so just letting you know. So what is spiritual health? Again, this is my definition, as I stated in the kind of disclaimer, right? These are my opinions, but again, I think these are some things that really encapsulate spiritual health for me. Awe, right, I think is just a concept. Again, I'm using very general terms. This could be, again, just realizing that the world is bigger than you, I think, and being sort of amazed by that, or taking appreciation in just, again, how kind of maybe what we call the mundane, but really when you get down to it, I think, especially as someone who's been sort of a nerdy scientist type person, you start to understand that, oh my God, like this plant has chlorophyll that's turning, these carbons into sugar and all. It's just even just some simple things we just walk by, plants growing, or again, where our oxygen kind of comes from. Again, all these different connections in the world. I think there's a lot to really be in awe of. So how do we kind of connect with that? Is that through, again, a specific kind of ideology, or is that just in your daily life? Is that journaling? It doesn't really matter how you do that or how you feel that, as long as that's a part of maybe your framework of health and spiritual health specifically. I put it in that sort of bucket of health. Gratitude kind of goes right along with this, right? Just feeling really grateful for, again, maybe some of that mundane stuff, some of the bigger stuff. I think we all tend to easily feel gratitude for, but I do think that I'll give some personal examples. Just having grown up visiting, let's say, a third world country like Bangladesh, I often can remember bathing as a child when people would have to go warm up water in a stove and sort of mix it with cold water just so I would have warm water. Or sometimes that wouldn't be possible because the electricity was out or something else was going on. So you just take kind of a cold bath, right? So, and that's like during my lifetime in the modern world. So again, just even like warm water plumbing is maybe one thing that I would say I can sort of remain grateful for. Again, just different ways that you can feel this, and again, different avenues. We'll talk about that. Again, I've already sort of alluded to this connection and interconnectedness. This is both person to person, but also people with the globe, people with other kinds of people, people with all different aspects of nature, different aspects of our, whatever lens, economy, this, that, however you want to sort of think about it. So many different lenses that once we learn to maybe step back and zoom out, we realize, or even maybe zoom in, either direction, you really just see that one thing starts to affect another in ways that are sort of not, let's say, completely obvious at first look. Sacred and sacraments, again, I do think this is a part of just humans, specifically spirituality. Again, this is what we're talking about. Just all humans have, over history, seem to have different kind of things that they've hold sacred, different sacraments, different practices. I think this ties into the human nature of wanting to really build a story. I think that's part of the way our brains work, and what is, again, really healthy for us, I believe. So again, this is sort of my opinion about global connection of health, is we have to sort of trust the things that we're sort of best built for, right? So if our brains are really built to want to fit things into a story, then we have to sort of respect that. And I think that a spiritual aspect of life is a really comforting way to build some of these stories where we don't have answers. And that's where some of these sacred and sacrament kind of things come in. These practices kind of connect you with some of that and sort of, again, give you a framework to feel like that's something real in the world, right? So that when you actually make something sacred, you're sort of taking something that's maybe metacognitive and then sort of assigning it maybe to a item or token or a practice, right? So then you're sort of, I don't know, making it into reality in a way, right? And I think that's an important part of our experience, and why that's a part of spiritual health.
Does that make us, as you were speaking, I thought, well, does that, like lighting a candle or doing whatever, does that just make us feel better? To have those rituals and those, some religions have.
I don't know specifically about maybe lighting a candle, but let's say we know that rhythmic drumming and dancing and other things like this can induce similar states to, let's say, even like psychedelic states. People go into states of trance and other things like this. So that's like on one extreme, right? Sort of milder versions of this would be sitting in a green space, for example, does release endorphins in the body, right? So when you're in a kind of greener, grassy trees, etc., right, kind of place, viewing different kinds of horizons have different effects on your neurology as well, change neural states, right? These are, so again, we're very tied to natural signals, right? It's not, if we have to have sort of this stimulus and feedback kind of relationship, right? And in fact, if you go into, let's say, sensory deprivation for long periods of time, right, you'll actually start to lose a lot of neural function, right? Because that's sort of required to keep those. If you don't use it, you lose it kind of thing, right? So let's say muscle loss, for example, if you're sort of laying in a hospital bed, right, you lose so much muscle within even like 2 or 3 days. It's, an exorbitant amount. So coming back to this again, spirit, purpose, meaning, and connection or values, right? These are other kind of ways to understand spiritual health. Let's say outside of. So I think what I didn't want to put on here is just like religion, right? Because I think that's the obvious one. So I do want to acknowledge that yes, that is certainly a major part of this for many people. And I'm not in any way, again, denying that. I'm just sort of trying to diversify what spiritual health can mean and sort of how religion functions maybe to increase health, right? So sort of looking at the different parts of what religion sort of maybe provides people, right? Because a lot of these things are provided by, let's say, a religious view, and that's great if that really works for you. So purpose, meaning, values, right? So that's, again, one kind of thing that always comes to my mind is I'm kind of stealing this from one of Peter Attia's podcasts, talking about when what do you, if you feel so terrible all the time, why be so healthy, sort of thing, right? If you're a longevity expert and so working out all the time doing all this stuff, like, but you're miserable, then what's the point? Sort of kind of, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't know the exact quote, but again, that sort of attitude comes to mind here, right? If you don't have some sort of connection and purpose and meaning in your life, then what's the point of doing everything else I talk about, trying to, again, eat healthy and avoid all the temptations here in this world and do all the things. Health is hard these days. I mean, I think that's what I'm trying to say here, is maybe that being healthy is really hard and a decision you have to make to sort of take back some things from maybe that our environment would maybe push us towards. So I think that's much harder if you don't connect that with something in this category of purpose, identity, meaning, values, right? And then that sort of, again, ties to this idea that we have a choice and that there is a me and there is a self and there is some sort of decision maker, right? And is that a consciousness? Is that a soul or spirit? I think that's really kind of, again, up to the specific person to designate. But again, that's what I'm getting at here, is spiritual health, just kind of respecting that. I think these are, whether you ignore this or you really lean into this, these are, I think, universal parts of the human experience and questions that we all ask at some point in our lives. And I would say, to push that towards health, we do need to ask these questions and maybe have an answer, is what I'm trying to get at. So any comments there or questions? Okay, perfect. So I'll dive just into a little bit of some history of spiritual ideas, just to give an idea of how diverse the choices are here for people, and how maybe, again, I think history kind of, when you look at it, it does make some sense where we are now, sort of in a lot of ways. Ideologically, I think looking back, there's a lot to learn and a lot that's telling and a lot that we can kind of, again, maybe bring back into the light, right? That we've maybe pushed to the side that was, in my opinion, maybe some ancient truths. So ancient civilizations, I'm getting at maybe ancient Greek civilizations, ancient Indian civilizations. So those are the Vedas. Those are kind of Greek and Roman mythology. That's going to be some of our kind of ancient Chinese traditions as well. These usually are kind of really story-driven traditions. So in the Americas, they're discovering that, again, there were these kind of, again, ancient tribes here of, especially, let's say, Mayan cultures, right, that we've seen that have very sophisticated calendars, very sophisticated kind of, you know, ties to just, again, solar knowledge, lunar knowledge, all sorts of things, right? And they had a very robust culture and practices of different kinds of sacraments, different monuments that were built. Again, this has happened all over the world. Egypt, for example, again, in the Americas, etc. So these are definitely seem to be tied to some sort of spiritual practices. You know, and that would make a lot of sense that these things were extremely important to these civilizations. Why spend so many resources? It's even a mystery how many of these structures are built to this day, or exactly when they were built and how they were built. So again, just I think most people agree that there were definitely something very important to humanity at that time. So again, we know that spirituality and different stories of this kind were extremely important to human beings from a very early time, right? This is maybe perhaps 10,000 or even longer years ago that we have evidence of spiritual practice. Right now, they're thinking even Neanderthals and early kind of non-Homo sapiens had some spiritual practices. So perhaps 300,000 to 400,000 years ago, we're talking about human and human-like species that have had spiritual type practices. So that's what I'm getting at here with those ancient civilizations. So what do I kind of take from that? I would say one of the points that of me kind of including this would be just that, again, if something has been preserved through evolution for, you know, maybe 400,000 years through maybe even multiple kinds of human species, it seems like to me that this is something that should be an important part of our lives, or at least something we look at. Right. So, and also another thing I think that's really unique, or sort of fiber that runs through a lot of these different spiritual practices of ancient times is a strong tie to natural signals, that the earth has a certain periodicity, you know, day and night cycle, and that the sun moves in a very specific way across the sky over periods of time, that the moon has a very specific cycle, and what is that relationship with the sun, right? These are some really important factors that a lot of these ancient civilizations were tied to. And I think about in modern life how we are in these kind of you know, artificially created boxes that really block out a lot of those signals, and that some people couldn't tell you, you know, how long it takes to continue, you know, let's say complete a full moon cycle. A lot of people don't necessarily even know that type of information. Most people know how long a day is, I hope. But so again, but just we've maybe lost some of our ties to some of those really kind of normal natural things that our health is now we're discovering right now. We're rediscovering, let me say, how important this is to our health in so many ways. Then we move a little bit more forward in history, and we come to a lot of sort of philosophy and lifestyle kind of based practices. These are some of our more actually written texts that we've found. So here I'm referring to things like Buddhism, Confucianism, the Vedas, some of our ancient texts, you know, and then I will get to the monotheistic texts as well. But so a lot of these are, again, really lifestyle-based kind of religions or spiritual practices. They may involve certain movement practices like yoga or other kind of Tai Chi or other things of this nature. They may involve certain eating practices, so we don't eat meat, or we do eat these things, or we don't eat, etc. You know, fasting practices are really common, let's say, in a lot of different types of practices, spiritual practices. So, and again, a lot of these don't necessarily emphasize a god or multiple gods or other things like this. They're sort of just philosophies and lifestyles. Again, a lot of these do involve stories with gods. Hinduism, for example, has multiple gods. and deities that sort of tell a story about a certain aspect of humanity. And there's different stories of the relationship of God and human beings, or human spirits. And again, there's some that believe in rebirth, and some that believe in sort of, so heaven and hell. All sorts of different beliefs here that arise in this kind of more modern period of history, right? And then we get into our major kind of three monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or Muslims. So those are some of our major religions that still exist today, right? And really dominate, let's say, the numbers-wise religious spheres, along with, like I said, Hinduism, Buddhism, still kind of major players in the world as well. So those are some of the, again, kind of quick history of some of our ancient spiritual beliefs, and then where we are kind of headed now to really a more growing kind of populations of people that would call themselves spiritual, not religious, right? So don't follow any particular religious sect, whether that be in any of these. To go back just a little bit, but I listed the big umbrellas, right? And then within those, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of sub-denominations, right, of people with really specific views on one particular thing or another particular thing. So again, I'm not here to sort of be a theologist and lecture on that, just to point out that that is the case, and that there's a diversity of thought here, and I see that as great, right? Then we have a diversity. We have 7 billion people on Earth, and great, we all can hopefully find some way to really make this work for us. Spiritual, not religious, gets at, again, that maybe we don't believe in a specific organized religious view, or we perhaps pull from many of these religious views or spiritual practices. So that can sort of, again, also contain maybe atheism and agnosticism, which the real difference there being believing in absolutely no God, and sort of, and I guess you could kind of label that as a separate category too. Agnosticism sort of talking about you believe there is some sort of creator, higher power, but you're not exactly attributing that to one particular story type thing. So again, this is something that has come into thought much more recently, let's say, at least that we can detect in, through written records and other historical kind of, thoughts and stories. And then kind of interesting thought that was brought to my attention, some books like Homo Deus, which is written by Yuval Harari, wrote Homo, or Sapiens, famously, it was one of his kind of bestseller books. Writes about this thing called dataism, where people are starting to think that, like, well, everything is sort of an information processing algorithm, and so the next step in evolution, right, is maybe for like AI and technology and these quantum computers and etc., right? And so they sort of have this almost spiritual view around some of that, and or the evolutionary process, let's say, or the scientific method. Right, so there are many people that turn some of these ideas into really kind of more robust spiritual views, really, that are more encompassing. So that's something that, again, I would say is really pretty modern with the advent of computers and now AI and other kind of high information processing technologies that can access, let's say, the entire internet. Great.
And I don't know if this is off subject, but where do you see AI taking us? I mean, other than down the dark path.
Sure.
But throughout the years, we've had different things come into play that influenced us, like the industrial world, the different things. So I just wonder how that's going to hook into our spirituality when, for me personally, I keep thinking, I don't know what's real anymore. I used to be, I thought, a fairly intelligent person, and I could understand right from wrong. I could understand black from white. But this AI blanket coming over us, it's kind of just unnerving me, I guess.
Yeah, so we have, I'll sort of summarize your question real quick. Basically, some concerns around where AI will lead us, and what are my thoughts around that. I don't know that I've, read on the subject enough to give you a full kind of opinion, but in general, I do feel sort of optimistic about humanity, and I think new things come along, and we find there is struggle, right? When new inventions come along, there are sometimes bad things that happen um, as a result. But I feel like we usually find a way to sort of harness that for, better eventually. Yeah.
Just need to stay grounded, I guess.
Right, because I think a lot of people, a lot of smart people share your concerns, right? And so a lot of people who are creating some of these technologies share those concerns and have openly talked about that too. So that's why I feel somewhat optimistic, on that topic again, because I've heard, people that are in the sort of field, let's say, really have those conversations and talk about that openly, which means that it's, again, on a lot of people's radar. So I don't know. Doesn't always guarantee you will go in the right direction all the time, but I think eventually that, yeah, yeah. So I guess I'm just an optimist in that way. So
I need that. I guess we can look back and see at different times when things fell apart or we made major changes, like to food content when the world came in and fast and quick and get it in the oven. I mean, when we look back, we see that's where our health really started to deteriorate to some extent. And we now have children that have diabetes, as not juvenile diabetes, but
sure,
type 2
yes.
And I think, if we look back, we can predict and see some stuff coming.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess how I'd sort of tie that to spiritual health here is that, again, it's, yes, a connection to humanity and caring about that, right? Because I think in some ways we got distracted by, let's say, sort of other outputs like, let's get calories to people as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible. Let's say, again, there's economic gains here too that happened, and again, there's a lot of stuff that sort of incentives that were made that sort of also played a role there. So I think if we really tie to something that's sort of deeper, that's more than economic growth, right? So what is that? And that's what I'm sort of trying to talk about here with spiritual health too, not necessarily on a greater, political, let's say, kind of level, but on an individual level, what does that mean to you, right? And what does that mean in your practical choices every day you make, and again, etc. So I guess it's sort of, again, part of why I'm having the talk and discussion today is, I do think this is important to the future of humanity for sure. And that would be kind of a nice, I think, segue to my next slide
and
here.
I was just going to say, like, if we don't learn from our history, we're destined to repeat it. So,
sure.
We've got, I'm 71 years old, so I've got a lot of history. I've seen a lot of things, come and go. And sometimes you just have to say this too shall pass. But can't we just learn from things and not have to make major mistakes? But I guess we just have to keep positive and
well, it reminds me of the purpose of meeting that you were talking about earlier as like the guiding light, so that we don't feel like we're just constantly falling into the closest temptation.
into the abyss.
Yeah.
Well, and so kind of, again, that's where this next slide is headed. So the for the people online and people here, we're just talking a little bit about, yes, how do we tie this to meaning and sort of, why, again, yes, some of us feel a lot of things about the world are headed in a dangerous direction. I think a lot of people feel that way on any side of any, again, just human people feel that way, at least in this country, because I live here. So I'll speak for kind of people I know here. But so, again, what does this really look like? And I think, again, what is that purpose, right? So when I ask about in my annuals, you know, what would you die for, right? What's so important you might die for it is another way I might ask this, or another way to start thinking about this, right? That might be the first question that I ask of many others. What's so, what do you live for, right? Is the opposite sort of that, and the more maybe positive that, but people that are like, oh, I don't know, right? So then it's like, what's so important? Maybe you die for it, right? And then at least it's a more dramatic question that hopefully people can come up with an answer with, and then we can start the conversation from there, sort of build off of that. These are just some ideas that I have, to kind of connect you to some sort of spiritual health, right? Is sort of what you were saying, right? Is being respectful to those descendants and trying to be a good ancestor. Again, I didn't come up with some of these ideas. I am taking these from just, again, a lot of things that I've listened to and that I found very influential in my life and thoughts. So again, yeah, just respecting that history, understanding that history, being interested, curious, right? That awe, that gratitude that it took, thousands of years of, people's struggles, and again, just a miracle, right? If that we can't find life on any other kind of rock curling around the sun, or let alone any other, place yet. So just the fact that we're alive, and that there's so many different things that are a part of our lives now, and that was built from, again, sort of very little to the kind of world we have now, and for all the abundance and sort of dopamine hits that maybe get us in trouble, right? That's still kind of a miracle that a lot of that exists, and that we're here, having this kind of live streamed on the internet that anyone from wherever can sign on. So just, again, I think there's a lot of awe, gratitude, meaning, purpose kind of things that you can derive just from understanding that that's as true as any other negative or depressing thought maybe we're having. And then, even if you don't have a direct ancestor, you influence the people around you. There's a community, you interact with people, right? And we play a role to the rest of humanity, I would say, as sort of ancestors to the future. And if we can't have connection or, meaning or something like that in any other way, I mean, these are just basic truths, I would say, that are, I think, in a lot of ways undeniable. And so that alone, to me, kind of gives at least one avenue of meaning, purpose, connection, a way to sort of think about why should I have. So let me kind of make this sort of sciencey for a second, right? So lying in a lot of ways might be really easier, right? It takes actually maybe sometimes, especially in difficult situations, to tell the truth takes more cognitive power. Let's say prefrontal cortex specifically, the kind of more human-y part of the brain, a big front executive part of our brain, activates more, right, when we're doing some truth-telling kind of tasks, rather than sort of lying and deception. So again, lying and deception is a part of evolution. Lots of other animals sort of deceive and lie and do other things like this. Right? I'm just saying that this part, a lot of kind of aspects that we have labeled over the years as really important values to humanity. Let's say, again, sort of not being a glutton, not killing other people, being a good neighbor, not lying. Some things that are, again, universally in lots of spiritual practices really important. These also seem to be tied to that prefrontal cortex part of the brain, right? So that's where, when you're doing some of these things, that part of the brain sort of grows or activates more. Right. So I sort of will talk about, like, that's the most human part, right? That's where a lot of our, and in some ways that's sort of true, right? The older parts of our brain, the amygdala and some of those other systems, right? get labeled this lizard brain and things like that. And that's not necessarily completely true. What they're getting at is that it's more ancient in evolution, right? We see these brain structures exist a little bit older, right, in evolutionary kind of trees, whereas the prefrontal cortex, one of the features of humanity is that really grew robustly, let's say, compared to other apes and chimps and other relatives of human beings, right? So then the things that that does, I don't think I'm really stretching too far to say are sort of more human kind of things. And I think that's what I'm sort of getting at here with, how would I tie this to neurobiology? But that's sort of what we're seeing with the neurobiology of this. So,
And does the frontal, now I'm gonna get geeky in science.
sure.
Does the frontal cortex stop growing at a certain point, and then are they different points for different people?
Yeah, so the
Because you see
prefrontal
some people that
cortex.
die all the time, even as adults,
Well, so
and yet.
prefrontal cortex does mature into your mid-20s, right? So probably a little later for males, which won't surprise you, and maybe a little bit earlier for females. So that's the general trends. Of course, person to person, it's, you can't necessarily just say, well, it's not absolutes like that, right? But if you generalize, that's what the general kind of trends look like. And about, let's say, 25, 26 for a man, maybe 2 years earlier for a woman, right? So, yeah.
I don't think we can necessarily blame cortex for that liar.
Sorry.
So,
Well, I'm just trying to understand. I try to wrap because I'm.
no, but there's
a person.
age is a big thing that's tied to this, right? So that there's like all sorts of different cognitive abilities that are strongly tied to age. This is much more obvious in childhood, right? Our childhood milestones, for example, are an example of this. So if you go to child checks will ask, oh, is your child stacking this many blocks and communicating in this way and doing this kind of problem solving, etc., right? And that tells us that certain parts of the brain are developing in the way they should be, right? So that's more obvious as a child, right? And then as you grow older, that's a little bit more vague what that looks like. But yes, a lot of those are those kind of higher order stop, kind of don't follow these impulsive kind of signal things that then prefrontal cortex feeds back on some of these other systems and says, no, like don't eat the 15, brownies right now all at once. So yeah, because it's whatever tied to this future bad outcome, right? So, but again, it's like your biology would otherwise tell you, yeah, eat those right now. Like, I mean, that's again, you're sort of, exactly. There's a lot of internal drives, right, to really have you try to, or whatever that food might be for people, or other kind of things like that. So, cosmic insignificance, where what I'm just talking about here is, this is both kind of a disturbing and comforting thing, right? So one that, especially let's say in times of just peril or other kind of distress, suffering, that's one that so many other people are probably sharing that with you, that over the years, especially, or even just right in that moment, probably in 7 billion other people, there's probably thousands, if not maybe millions of people that are sharing your emotion with you in that moment. That again, there's some comfort in sort of how wide and vast the world and the universe is, and that you're not alone, really. You may just feel alone in that sort of moment. Right, so that's one kind of aspect of what I think this can be. Also, just like, again, like people that are, let's say another kind of example of this is sometimes we're just overly driven. We feel like, no, I'm the only one that can get this done. I'm the only person that can, do even, let's say, do this surgery or do whatever, and sometimes maybe you are, right? But if that's at the cost of, other things that maybe, should you be sacrificed? I'm just saying, are we asking these questions of each other? Are we allowing those liberties of our systems, right? Is it okay to have only one neurosurgeon for whatever, 1 million people or et cetera, so that we've just allowed that to happen, right? And then that person has to feel that way. So where does that tie into this cosmic insignificance? For most of the time, that's not the case, right? And the world is really just going to move on. And, you're not necessarily that important all the time, right? And you can back off and say no and take some time to yourself and, try to get in tune with yourself, right? So that's what I'm sort of getting at here and how this can play a role in people's lives. Because it is true that the universe is vast and that we are sort of, in some ways, just little specks. So, however, when we zoom into that miraculous little blue planet, right, we see that we are so highly interconnected, right, that not just the things on this planet as I described, right, the reason plants kind of come into bloom, right, is because the sun moves around the earth and the earth has a certain tilt and has these seasons, and everything is sort of just really interconnected. And again, this is what a lot of spiritual views sort of get at, right, and sort of give stories about maybe what happens after we die and where we came from and other things that sometimes we don't have definite answers for. I think any way you look at it, though, if you really look at the, if you really just watch the world around you, I don't even think you need to read a science textbook to understand this. You just need to really carefully observe what's going on around you, and you'll realize that, again, things are so connected to one another. Why does our mood sort of maybe go down a little bit when the sunlight is less? And again, we are solar powered. And belief effects what you believe and who you sort of identify, what values you to identify with, and the things that you really define yourself around. Let's just say this specifically in medicine looks like if you believe a certain thing about anything intervention you do, it affects the intervention. Right, so if you believe it's going to work, there's this belief effect that's separate, let's say, from a placebo effect. Okay, so this is something different than a placebo effect that's been sort of elucidated in some kind of nifty scientific studies. So that we do think that, again, we sort of know about these belief effects. So what's happening there? Again, I'm not going to answer that necessarily. I'm just telling you that there's data that really suggests that that is a real thing going on.
So help me to understand. So I've always heard of the placebo.
Sure.
But what's the difference between?
So a placebo effect would be, you take a real medicine and then someone takes a sugar pill, right? And they have some of the effects of the real medicine, right? But a belief effect would be that two people take the same medicine and the people that are told that this will help you more do better than the people that will tell you, well, this is not a really good medicine. Yeah, even though they took the same medicine. Right, that might be one example of how that's sort of different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think in the belief effect is an overall umbrella type thing. Like, you have your beliefs in religion or whatever, and then the placebo comes in and plugs into that.
It's probably involved. Again, I don't know that that's fully been teased out, but basically the type of thing what I call here is what I just said, right? So that what you believe that intervention will do changes the outcomes of the intervention compared to other people's opposite beliefs, let's say, of the same intervention. So again, so there are many interventions that again, I tell people, like, if you don't feel good about this, like, I don't think you should do it, right? Just because, again, it does affect certain outcomes of what's going to happen, right? And that's not just, let's say, with specifically, let's say, with some like psychedelics come to mind, set and setting, right? And sort of talking about like your mindset really matters when you go into these settings, right? But let's say aside from that, I talk about this with just like whatever, supplements, drugs, other things, even like other exercise interventions, testing, labs, or other tests that I get with patients, we would talk about like, look, like this is not something you want to do, then I'm not going to push you to do this, right? I think, again, Some of you may have heard me say that to you. So, yeah. So anyway, so again, that's part of that is driven through this, evidence that belief does affect the intervention, right? So I'm not just trying to be necessarily nice. I also think there is chemistry or sort of some sort of therapeutic effect there, right, that we have to respect as well. So that's, again, as I stated, my opinions here. So true self, this is, again, a concept that's been talked about by all sorts of different people that really describe this better than I probably will today. But just really connecting to what is it that really brings you that deep interest and kind of maybe captivates you, really increases that awe in your life, right? The things that really do that, I would say, are sort of maybe helping you understand what that true self really is and wants. Some people talk about maybe, other inner child work and different, again, this can go into all sorts of psychology and psychiatric kind of work. But just, again, even thinking about, like, again, if we go back to there is some sort of consciousness, soul, spirit kind of part of me, us, all of us, then are we trying to connect with that aspect, right? Are we sort of only feeding other aspects of ourselves? There was a kind of there's some psychological models that really talk about that our brain and selves are really kind of like a bunch of different selves, kind of types of people that are all sort of interacting with one another, right? And then maybe there's another kind of true self that is, in theory, the overseer and kind of decision maker of all of this chatter. And so, are we trying to find that voice, or are we always lost, let's say, in these other voices, right? And we'll get to some practices maybe that help us connect with that, right? But this is what I'm getting at, maybe again with that umbrella of spiritual health, right? And again, you can see how this can be tied to a specific practice of whatever named religion, etc., right, or not, right? And so I'm trying to, again, show people that this can go either way, and that, again, the other message here is this is really tied to health. We'll talk about here in a second. That importance of story, right? So that is the way we build. Really, that's our lives are built in these stories. And when we can't make sort of stories out of things, it's very distressing to our brains. Or sometimes we make stories that are sort of only partially, true, right? And then that functions to keep us in some sort of locked position, let's say. So just recognizing, right, again, are we looking at those other aspects of ourselves? Are we respecting that we have this ability to reflect on ourselves, right? The brain has the ability to reflect on the brain, which is really, really cool aspect of humanity. And again, maybe some other creatures, we don't necessarily know that for sure, but at least we know we can do that. I think it's pretty evident. And so again, just respecting some of this stuff, right? And again, it's hard to say eat right and exercise and get sunlight and all this if you have just none of this, right? If you've never, I don't know. To me, this is kind of a base layer of wanting to be healthy and having that motivation to be healthy also. And just being whatever, kind and honest and etc. These things, let's say again, that you have no other kind of reason. I would say there are really good health reasons, and they grow really important parts of our brain, let's say. So what are some ways that, again, so prayer and meditation are sort of some of the studies we've looked at, like how does spirituality, right, affect health? Specifically have looked at things like prayer and meditation, which is why I have that sort of at the beginning of this slide. But I think there are other sort of nuanced ways that they've looked at just how mystical experiences and other kinds of spiritual practices have really influenced health. And basically everything they've looked at is positive, right? So it helps with your blood pressure, it helps with your all sorts of named mental health conditions, specific, also non-specific. It's helped with certain biomarkers like cortisol and insulin resistance, and all sorts of other sort of very specific measurables. Again, going back to this why be healthy, right? It's, I mean, also just not respecting that part of our lives. I just would really, I think it's really hard to then say, well, yes, I am going to avoid all this temptation and, you know, whatever. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about doing are hard, I think, in the modern world, especially. Again, I don't know, but I would, just thinking about it, it seems like it's a little harder now than maybe it would have been when we didn't have TVs and, you know, all this other stuff. And, you know, to ask someone to meditate 20 minutes, you know, once a day, let's say, nowadays can be a very hard ask of people. You know, certain spiritual practices sort of built this in. For example, my ancestors, a lot of my ancestors are from the Muslim tradition that have sort of a 5-prayer system daily, which is based on sort of the times of day, so sunlight, or times they change with basically the change in seasons. And anyway, so that's sort of, again, it's, you can do that privately within just a few minutes. But even though I personally don't necessarily do that or follow some of those traditions, I do see how that functions to just, again, it is sort of the centering, right? You're actually kneeling and touching the ground, right? And sort of, again, literally sort of, you know, bowing before something greater than yourself. I can just now really appreciate what that does sort of in the human experience, right? And that's what I'm sort of talking about here. Again, does it have to be in that exact way, right? Absolutely not, right? And, but if you're never maybe putting your feet on the ground, or, you know, never sitting on the ground, or never really in touch with, or just looking at our beautiful mountainscape, or again, so many different things, especially here in Kenyan, you know, that I think we can appreciate natural beauty at least, and other things that are greater than us in other ways. You know, I think that can function as meditation. I do think, you know, meditation kind of in the sense of looking at our own thoughts in a neutral, non-judgmental way, and allowing those to kind of bubble up and sort of pass. That specifically has a lot of sort of scientific studies to support it. So that's what I can say about that practice, right, is that there is a lot of not just experience, right, thousands of years of experience, but also now people who want some sort of evidence. I would say there is a lot of evidence there for that kind of practice. So funny to, again, endorse things we've been doing for thousands of years, but yes, it seems like there's a reason that we've been doing that.
I
So
always call it taking a pause.
sure.
You know, sometimes we're, you know, when you say, well, can't you meditate for 20 minutes? It's like, where would you find that 20 minutes in my day that I could do that? But I think sometimes we get bent out of shape about thinking it has to be maybe 20 minutes in total.
Oh, sure.
You know, maybe it's 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, a half a minute, you know, whatever, take a pause.
Great
And
suggestion
allow
there.
the
Yes.
system
30
to-
seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes,
Yeah.
all of it
It's a
counts.
key twist.
So
And so I think sometimes people tend to shy away from some of these beneficial things because we don't have the time.
this isn't
Yeah, but-
necessarily about that, but I would say exercise has similar evidence, right? And some of you have heard me kind of talk about that, that as little as 30-second bursts of exercise have actually measurable benefits if done sort of broken up throughout your day, especially. But yes, I would say spirituality can also sort of be, you know, broken up into more digestible sections. Especially, again, that's sort of maybe what we're used to nowadays, a little bit more short segments of stimulation So then in that way, there are lots of things that are built around that, some of the meditation apps and other things like that. I'm not as familiar maybe with the prayer space, so I'm not trying to not talk about prayer. I'm sure there's some great kind of prayer resources out there too. I'm just a little more familiar personally with the meditation space, so that's why I'm sort of touching on that more. So kind of jumping right into how do we kind of make this happen in our lives, right? So group practice, this can look like all sorts of ways, right? So I think, group practice, there's something to that, pushing yourself out of that comfort zone, sharing this with other people, right? I think is a part of this. I've talked a lot about interconnectedness and connection, and part of that is with other people, I do believe, right? So spiritual practice, I think, can be done in lots of ways by yourself, but I think there's some interesting things that happen when you allow this to happen in a group setting too. So it's not always. It just means maybe sometimes, maybe not never, is what I'm suggesting here. So whatever that looks like according to your own spiritual view, or maybe this looks like maybe exploring some other spiritual views, right? So joining a chanting circle, or checking out a new church, or a totally different spiritual experience, etc. Right? This again can look in all sorts of different ways. Especially nowadays, we have again so many choices, so many different locations that we can go, right, in spaces that are built for this, and have sort of a program ready for you. That are hopefully in line with some of your views and values and identity. So step outside your comfort zone, right? That's how growth happens, right? So if we're always sort of just doing the same exact thing, then really you're not encouraging that neuroplasticity and that growth and that curiosity and awe and gratitude, right? Have you kind of come from some new experiences as well. That's a really healthy way, let's say, to kind of increase dopamine and some of these other neurochemicals that make us feel good, right? Rather than turning to the, social media and other kind of food and substances and other things that do this maybe more quickly and reliably and easily, right? We can turn to these other ways that actually enrich our lives in really meaningful ways, and maybe connect us with people that we wouldn't have connected with before, and open new opportunities and teach us new things, right? So many things that can happen when you just try to be a little more curious and really push yourself to be a little bit uncomfortable. So just really encouraging that in the spiritual space as well as maybe all aspects of life. Guided, journals. So if you don't want to necessarily, journaling is a great tool, right? If you don't know what to even write, I just don't even know where to start. Okay, well, there's guided journals for you, right? And there's lots of free ones out there for you that have some prompts and really get you started. I think once you get started, usually things can really flow from there. But there is sort of that block that these things can really help people get over. There's a lot of, again, tools nowadays to kind of increase some of these types of things. A gratitude journal, right, is a simple thing, writing 2 or 3 things you're grateful for each morning or every night before you go to bed. So retreats, these are sort of high dose, single events, right, that infuse kind of that energy into people. But then, the only kind of drawback, let's say, with retreats is exactly what I said, right, is that then you come back to a world that maybe hasn't changed a lot, but maybe you've changed, and sort of coming back. And again, sort of making sense of that sometimes is I've seen that sort of, again, go a lot of different directions for people. So just being aware that happens, and that is something just to think about in your experience with going to a retreat. What are you coming back to? What concrete changes are you going to maybe make perhaps before you go, so that when you return, that there's a lot more success or sustained kind of changes. Right? I talk about objectives here, right? So what is your objective? Keep that in mind, right? And then sort of build out from there. Creative expression, I think this is a lot of kind of spiritual connection, right? This is a way that humans express spirituality. This goes all the way back to, let's say, cave art, some of our most ancient kind of things that seem to have spiritual connections. Again, music, right, which may be one of the most ancient forms of language, right, and exists in, let's say, all sorts of other species of animals, right, and is a form of kind of connection, literal connection. Your brain literally synchronizes with music and sort of fires in synchrony with music, which doesn't really happen with other types of external stimuli. So we know that this is sort of a interesting, unique your neural state as well. And again, sort of maybe an ancient form of language even. So seems to again really be tied to that spiritual aspect of our lives. So dance, right? I described that dance and other practices like this are even ways that people have reached, let's say, trance-like states and other kind of, can induce even visions and other things like that, right? And all sorts of different connections with different kind of aspects of our lives, aspects of reality, different planes of existence, if you will. Okay, so again, I think creative expression is something that we all should sort of strive to have be a part of our lives in whatever way that suits your particular skills or interests. Or maybe build some new ones, right? You have to fail maybe, 10,000 times before you get good at something, right? Is a lot of what the 10,000 hours, let's say, is what it takes to become an expert. 10,000 kind of trials, right, is a sort of goal number if you wanted to shoot for, right? That's about what it takes to try to really gain some expertise in something. So you're gonna have some failures in there. So again, don't let that hold you back, right? Is what I'm saying. Um, Unplug, right? Get out in nature, put our phones down. These are kind of addictive drugs, right? And sort of are built to be a slot machine and built to capture that, dopamine and attention. There's, selling that on your behalf. That's, again, what is definitely happening. That's the model that they're using. And so just put it down and sort of get out in the spaces that we know actually promote good biology, right? So just being in a green space, I told you earlier, promotes endorphins and all sorts of kind of feel good biology. We have, again, just all sorts of things that our brain and body are expecting from that natural world in order to really be healthy. Sunlight, again, grounding, so many different things, right, that we just need. Sleep, let's say, right? So also kind of that, having both night and day, right? We also need that rest, right? So just again, respecting that that's the way we're built. Um, I've mentioned psychedelics here can be a kind of tool to connect as well, right? As well as just again, so many different things here that I didn't put on this slide that also are different. So many small aspects of life. Just connection with other people, social events, having a weekly dinner with some people that you love, or again, just helping your neighbor. So many things can really tie into how we increase our spiritual health. Nowadays, there are some really nice resources out there for us and kind of ways to consume this in at home and free and also paid for. Again, some of these things do have some cost to them. There's meditation apps. There's, again, I mentioned that's just the space I'm more familiar with. I did look, and there are plenty of kind of prayer and other kind of religious specific kind of apps there available to. Again, there's so many different books on spirituality, religion, the history of religion, ancient civilizations, ancient practices. Obviously, there's the plethora of religious texts that are available. Again, not going to list all of those specifically, but again, tons of different religious texts here associated with all sorts of different religions, spiritual views, as well as just books generally about those subjects and more generally about theology. Podcasts that really talk about some of the health connections like Huberman Lab, and then again, so many different podcasts about just Buddhism and daily meditations, daily Christianity kind of, Bible verses, different surahs from, or on the Muslim side, right? Different things in the Judaic practices of just, again, there's everything really has an app these days and other kinds of things to really help you bring this right into the palm of your hand or turn that maybe otherwise addictive device into something that does function to maybe help push you in a positive direction as well. So I think the last one Carolyn put on there, but I'm not exactly familiar with that. She was not feeling well today. So,
Oh, you've got a reputation too.
yeah. But yeah, again, really appreciate everybody joining online. I don't know if anyone had any comments. I didn't really hear anything from the online people, but hopefully everybody could hear me and see me. Otherwise, this will be on the YouTube later. We do have, let's go to this next slide. Our next talk here on the 11th at 10 a.m. Again, we do post this on our calendar. These do go on our YouTube channel afterward. The calendar's on my website. Everything lives on the website. If you remember nothing else, desertrivermed.com. If you start there, you can usually get to all of my other resources. And again, we'll hope to see you guys in April. Haven't fully decided on the topic yet. Any comments?
Thank you for having us.
Perfect.
That was good fun.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, guys. Are you guys planning on coming on the walk at all?
Not yet.
I've got to head back, but I appreciate it. I've
Okay.
been curious about spirituality versus religion.